Hello class, welcome to journal number 3, our third and last of our video discussions where we get to talk about something a little bit differently this time. So to trace our path, we've been looking at the origins of baseball, the development of sports heroes, but today we're actually going to get into like something more recent that maybe some of you can relate to, at least if you follow sports thoroughly. And that is the idea that athletes can get involved in political protests. So let me take you back to the year 2018. In February 22nd of 2018, the Fox News host Laura Ingraham basically came down on NBA superstar LeBron James, telling him basically to shut up and dribble. This was in response to James voicing some protests about the White House and about the administration. So, using his platform as an NBA player, superstar, essentially he was coming down and using his voice to display political opinion. But Ingraham said, shut up and dribble. Now, that created a storm of controversy in itself, but it's a good segue to kind of begin to develop the idea of like how much athletes have been involved in politics and vice versa, because those of you that follow sports know Michael Jordan. And clearly, a few decades prior to the advent of LeBron James, Michael Jordan, the superstar, once was quoted in a book called The Second Coming, a book by Sam Smith, as saying, Republicans buy sneakers too. This was in reference to the idea that he did not want to get involved in politics. So by being apolitical, never taking a stand on one side or the other, LeBron James was certain to kind of balance that fine line so he wouldn't offend anyone. So it's a good point to kind of bring up, to kind of look at the idea of how athletes have historically involved themselves in political discussions. And American athletes and American sports have tried to express themselves on the political realm in some way, shape, or form throughout the 20th century. I mean, they tried even in the late 19th century, if you recall our lecture on baseball. However, because the juggernaut of business is not what it is now, back 100 plus years ago, athletes never really found a very firm voice to demonstrate what they felt strongly about, whether it was World War I, whether it was World War II, whether it was anything else for that matter. But historically, athletes have tried to kind of influence politics in one shape or form throughout history. Like the first major development actually was in 1936 in the Olympic Games. Those of you that follow sports might know that the 1936 games were held in Berlin. Nazi Germany, Berlin. So Adolf Hitler was using the fact that the city was going to host the Olympic Games as a platform to talk about Aryan superiority. His move against the Jewish people was already taking effect by 1936, and Jewish athletes had an issue with this. I mean, they tried desperately to urge a boycott of the Games. But the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, squashed any idea of a boycott by December of 1935. And the U.S. team went to Nazi Germany. Those of you that may know, 18 African Americans actually were on that team. And one notable African American, Jesse Owens, happened to win 4 Olympic gold medals. He won the 100, he won the 200, he won the long jump, and he was a member of the sprint relay gold. So it was a silent demonstration against Adolf Hitler and his policies in 1936, but the idea that politics could get involved in sports, and at the time, the Olympic Games are probably one of the biggest platforms for sports throughout the world. Now, no NBA yet, but Major League Baseball and the NFL, you have them throughout the 1930s, professional sports, I should say, but the Olympics are probably the most important, at least on an international stage. And in many respects, because of that importance, the Soviet Union had to pay more attention all of a sudden to the Olympic Games, because when they were founded shortly after World War I, the Soviets just did not participate in any Olympic Games. But after 1945, after the Second World War, when there were two superpowers left, the United States and the Soviet Union, the Soviets believed that it was imperative that they partake in the Olympic Games so they could kind of be part of this Cold War, this silent yet intense rivalry between capitalism and communism to see which culture, which ideology was superior over the other. And by 1952, you have Soviet participation in the very first Olympic Games. So when the Cold War is full blown by the 1950s, you have what you may think about now. Medal counts, where the Soviets rank, where the Americans rank, where the Chinese rank, and so forth. So this becomes a platform, a vehicle, so to speak, for political ideology, the Olympic Games. And these continued, in many respects, to kind of demonstrate themselves here and there. And there are going to be other protests in the years following 1952. I mean, Major League Baseball, if you recall, Jackie Robinson, there's rumblings, slowly percolating underneath about the idea of civil rights for baseball. The NFL, has rumblings underneath in regards to the Vietnam War by the 1960s. But at this point, if you know the name Muhammad Ali, you'll recognize, like the heavyweight champion of the world, threw himself, figuratively speaking, into the ring to protest the Vietnam War. He was not going to participate on the draft. He was not going to be included. He was labeled a conscientious objector. I mean, he was ostracized and politically found guilty of evading the draft. I mean, people worried about what message it would mean, for other young Americans if they too became conscientious objectors. But this was critical. Like, the war was a source of protests throughout the 1960s. And if not for Supreme Court, intervening and overturning his conviction, chances are that Muhammad Ali could have been ostracized from the world stage even longer. But nevertheless, you have, by the late 1960s now, you have athletes kind of pushing the envelope into further and further debates over sports, over political protests. And I believe, if you take a person face-to-face class with me, I always rail on 1968 as being probably the most critical year in many ways for the United States. If you think about 1968, you realize that the Vietnam War is still going on. The president has been misleading the American public about the success of the Vietnam War, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He has chosen not to run for re-election in November 1968. That's important too. But the Olympic Games, which were held a little bit later than usual that year, in October of 1968 in Mexico City, become, in many respects, the perfect storm for political activism. I mean, think about why, and hopefully you could understand. I mean, for one thing, television is really taking shape by 1968, so there's a growing popularity that people can actually watch the games live now. There's also the growing popularity of the Olympics. I mean, nation states are each promoting the importance of the Olympic Games for their own reasons. I mean, the United States wants to promote that they are the better country. The Soviet Union wants to promote that they are the better country. And this rivalry just kind of latches on to the media really pushing the Olympic Games. And the fact that they're being hosted so close to the United States, just south in Mexico City, I mean, that's another reason. They're in the same time zone. Americans' attention will be paying very close heed to what's going on in Mexico City. But that's just not it. There's additional factors as to why 1968 is so pivotal. I mean, it is devastating in many respects for Americans. Not only because of the war, not only because of the controversies over LBJ, but this is also 1968, the year that civil rights has really risen to the forefront because nothing is being done. Even though Brown versus Board of Education was more than a decade earlier, people are still upset that civil rights has not pushed any further, any more rapid changes, any greater developments. And to top it off, you also have the war on poverty. This great society that Johnson had envisioned. I mean, Americans are poor. Americans are struggling in many ways. The war is raging around them. But then you have like a couple of additional blows to the psyche of America. One blow is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968. I think all of you can surmise that the black community is just torn by this. But just a few months later, the nation is torn up yet again with the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Yes, the former Attorney General, the brother of John F. Kennedy, he's assassinated in June of 1968. So you have two pivotal assassinations. The latter, Kennedy's assassination, due to America's involvement with Israel. He's shot by a pro-Palestinian advocate. I mean, this really churns up the country. It has a significant effect. But the United States is not alone. Further south, in Mexico City itself, students and labor groups are protesting a lack of advancement. I mean, they are actually using the Olympic Games and all the cameras that are going to be paying attention to them as a way to bring international attention to the problems in Mexico. Poverty, wages. On October 2nd, 1968, the president of Mexico cannot allow this protest to occur. And the thousands of protesters that are gathered around Mexico City are met with heavy force. No one knows exactly how many people died, but a safe estimate is in the hundreds. Like 400 is one of the most safest of all estimates. Thousands of Mexican students are arrested. Government soldiers, government tanks. I mean, this was about trying to oppress, any dissent, any protests, even before the TV cameras came the following week. And once those cameras did come in, the United States contingent really began to kind of flex its muscles. One of the most pivotal protests held in Mexico City was after the 200-meter dash. Tommy Smith won the gold. John Carlos from the United States got the bronze. An Australian broke up the two Americans, but during the medal ceremonies, both Smith and Carlos appeared on the podium with no shoes, black socks, and with one black glove. When the Americans lowered their heads and raised their fists, it created a ruckus. Back home, Americans were aplomb with anger and resentment. Avery Brundage, head of the Olympics, had a fit about all this. I mean, there were no objections when the Nazis saluted one hand because they claimed it was part of their government. And clearly the one hand raised salute by both Carlos and Smith was not part of any government policy. But the International Olympic Committee expelled both of those men from the Games. And the backlash that they received back home, death threats, athletic careers cut short, I mean, it had a ripple effect after 1968. But as much notoriety and controversy as that protest garnered both of these men, you must also recognize that it opened up the floodgates for political protests. In 1972, for example, basketball player at UCLA, Bill Walton, yes, that Bill Walton, if future NBA superstar, future star of announcing. He protested the Vietnam War in 1972. Throughout the 1970s, women began to protest a lack of access to sports, whether it be the Boston Marathon or whether it be collegiate sports. Title IX is on the way. Something to keep in mind. Biggest protests of all were held by nations. The 1980 and the 1984 Olympic Games both had boycotts from national contingents. In 1980, the United States protested the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, so they refused to take any teams, any athletes, to the Olympic Games in Moscow. And of course, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc returned the favor in 1984 when the Olympic Games were hosted in Los Angeles at the Coliseum. So, for athletes whose window for a career, for an athletic performance is so minute, so short, this was devastating. But you could not get through a year, a few months without some political protest, and even to the century. In the 2000s, for example, during the Iraq War, MLB started to play God Bless America. Well, some players didn't take too kindly from this, especially since they're international players now. And the Blue Jays first baseman, Carlos Delgado, took a seat. He says, I don't believe in war, I'm not going to stand, while this propaganda goes on, and he created an uproar in the early 2000s. A decade later, police brutality, especially after and around the George Floyd incident, protests, t-shirts, kneeling salutes, in both the NBA and the NFL were common. Some of these obviously garnering a lot of attention and, of course, criticism. And if you're paying close attention to right now, the WNBA, they are protesting. They're protesting their conditions, their labor contracts, and this is not something that is rather uncommon. The NCAA went through a number of protests as well, comparing the NCAA basketball tournament for men with the NCAA tournament for women. The disparity, the lack of attention. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that even though politics got involved late in sports, by the 1960s really, you can't divorce the two anymore. And I know, I used Laura Ingraham, Fox News as a way to kind of talk about this discussion, telling athletes to just basically stick to sports. And you hear that all the time, but it's impossible. I suggest it's impossible because people have opinions, and sometimes it's impossible to keep those opinions just squashed down, especially when governments are getting involved, like the 1980 and the 1984 Olympic Games. Drug use is also a way to ostracize a nation state, a suspected national contingent, and this happens also in the Olympic Games. So for people to think that athletes can divorce their opinions, whether it's from religion, whether it's about war, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about any other aspect of American life, just keep in mind that there's a long legacy. And whether you agree with it or not, this legacy of athletes getting involved in politics, it may not be seen favorably at the time, but that's what history is for, to kind of look back, to think about, Muhammad Ali was right. And he got recognized after the fact, for standing up for his principles. John Carlos and Tommy Smith had death threats, but in their later years, they received applause and congratulations for standing up for something that they believed in. And this is what I want to convey to you, is that athletes sometimes get involved in politics because it is something that they believe in. But that's what I want to leave you with, something to kind of think about as we kind of work our way through this course. But in the meantime, I appreciate you listening. Take care.